Tim Jackson, welcome to the Climate Pod.
It's great to be here. Thanks for inviting me.
We are an ecological economist and the director of the Center for the Understanding of Sustainable Prosperity. So let's start there. What does sustainable prosperity look like to you?
um, I think it's a way of characterizing the idea that prosperity is not just about wealth, it's not just about income. Um, in fact, one of the lessons of the last year, you could say, is that one of the first things prosperity is about is health. And health is an interesting place to start because it's a metaphor that speaks not of having more and more all the time, but having an appropriate balance, having a good balance actually between deficiency and excess. And it gives us a way of targeting, if you like, a vision of the good life that is about being in balance physically, being in balance in our community, in our family, being in balance in the natural world, and even perhaps being in balance spiritually. So to me, sustainable prosperity is a very multi-dimensional concept, and it's a way of thinking about social progress and indeed individual well-being that goes beyond just thinking about money.
Well, your new book, Post-Growth: Life After Capitalism, explores the critical problems of capitalism that have led us to, this terrible financial and social and ecological crises that we're facing today. And in the book, that you argue that the proliferation and ultimate demise, really, of capitalism is a result of the myth of growth. So what is the myth of growth?
Um, I start by sort of recognizing that every culture has a kind of myth that guides it. What is progress in our society? What does it mean to do well here? And so the myth of growth to me is our particular cultural myth. It's a myth that sort of says progress is about economic growth and cashed out in really quite simplistic ways through accounting for the extent of the economy, the gross domestic product, how big it is, how fast it's growing, and that's what counts as progress, both politically and to some extent socially, up to a point. I think that myth has begun to break recently because people have realized that a lot of the growth in the GDP actually hasn't benefited ordinary people and is sometimes even undermining communities and creating inequality and trashing the planet. But nonetheless, for the last 50 to 60 years, I think you could say that basically we've developed a society, particularly in the West, in which we think about our progress in terms of growth in the size of the economy measured through this indicator, the GDP. And it's that really sort of constitutes a myth, in the sense that it's almost something that you can't question. It's kind of irreducible as a part of our political economy, and it's almost like a mantra that certainly after the financial crisis, and probably I suspect beginning to happen after this one, that the governments and politicians repeat over and over again that what they're looking for now is growth. They want growth back, and they want growth here in this sector, and they want growth in that sector, and it's growth that will give us jobs, and it's growth that will deliver us progress. And that's the sense, I guess, in which I call it a kind of cultural myth, because it almost becomes invisible, I guess is the word. It becomes invisible to us because we assume that it is part of the backdrop of our society, that it's immutable, that we couldn't change it even if we wanted to, and it therefore has that kind of character of being a narrative that's part and parcel of our lives.
I learned so much from reading this book, a lot about characters who I am familiar with, but maybe, you've explored some thoughts, some thinking that they had that, that I might not have necessarily associated them with. Specifically, one is Robert Kennedy, and you recount the first two speeches by Kennedy during his presidential campaign in 1968, where he talks about GDP and growth. So, what did Kennedy have to say about gross domestic product on that day?
Well, it always fascinated me, that speech. I mean, I'd been working probably in this field, looking at the interaction between growth and sustainability, broadly speaking, I don't know, for a decade or so before I came across that speech, and I remember very clearly it was uncovered. I think the recording of it was uncovered in the basement of the University of Kansas at some point around about 15, 20 years ago. I don't remember exactly. And it was this, I remember this kind of excitement, a kind of frisson of excitement that this person, who was a presidential candidate at that point in time, a very influential figure, part of the Kennedy family, had actually taken that same critical stance about the GDP as an indicator, but also about growth and our vision of prosperity through growth as well. It was an extraordinary speech, really, for a would-be president of the richest economy in the world, a very fast growing economy at that point in time, an economy and a country mired in conflict, social unrest, uncertainty in 1968. It was a very, very turbulent year for the US. And here was this presidential candidate out on the presidential trail for the first time. His first two speeches both spoke of the limitations of the way that we think about progress, the limitations of the GDP, the limitations of growth, and talking about a much wider social vision that was more inclusive, that talked about meaning and purpose as being important to our dignity, that created a culture, in a way, a sort of political culture that just wasn't there until he made those points. And they came right in the middle of the Vietnam War. They came right in the middle of the riots on campuses around race. And they struck a chord. They struck a chord that I think is as relevant today as it has ever been. And it was extraordinary, kind of, writing that story during the summer of 2020, when actually so many of those issues came to the fore again.
Definitely, yeah. So if not GDP, then what would be a better measure of social progress?
Well, I think you kind of, in a way, your first question to me sets the answer to that up, because when you start asking what prosperity is, and you think about it in different ways, if you think about it as health, if you think about it as well-being, if you think about it as balance and us being in balance with the planet, then those are the things that you have to kind of go out and measure. You have to, figure out and realize very fast that we're out of balance in the planet. The carbon, the climate crisis and the carbon issue is one of the ways in which you have to think about measurement. You have to establish the limits of what we can do on the planet and be sustainable on it, and which we can be healthy on such a planet. You have to do that in relation to other species. You have to establish those limits, and those are all really, to some extent, measurement problems. What are the limits, and what's our impact at the moment? Are we sustainable at this point in time? Which side of those limits do we stand? We know where we stand in relation to climate. We know we have to have a very fast decarbonization to a zero or possibly net zero economy, and that's something that we can, must, and should measure and define for ourselves as being a kind of limit to the economy. But it isn't just limits you're measuring, it is also, as you suggested, it's progress. And how do we measure that progress? I think, to some extent, we measure it through the health of the poorest in society, the health of those who are most vulnerable in society. Are we making progress? It's not about what the rich are doing. It's not about, Jeff Bezos and Elon Musk and the possibility that we're sending people to Mars in a few years' time. It's about the fate of the poorest, most vulnerable people in society. And if you're not measuring that, if you're not paying attention to that, and I think that was really, Robert Kennedy's point back in 1968, then you as a society are not making progress. So it's, and setting up those measures is not impossible. I mean, we can look at inequality, we can look at vulnerability, we can look at deprivation, we can look at the quality of our lives in terms of meaning and purpose and dignity and fulfillment. And there are very, very good measures of all of those things. And they, although they struggle in the sense that the GDP is one big headline measure, which seems to want to try to reflect everything. And these multiple measures don't do that, but they are a much more nuanced way of guiding our progress. It's kind of like saying, the only thing I'm going to look at if I'm driving my car is the revs meter, the revs counter. How many RPM am I doing? And it's just, that's not a good way to drive a car. If you're not looking around you, if you're not looking in a rear view mirror, if you're not understanding the progress of the cars around you, if you're not understanding where your brake pedal is, for example, or when you need to apply that brake pedal, then you've got a very, very bad governance model of that particular transport situation. And I should say, of course, that I'm not necessarily condoning driving in cars. But you take my point. I mean, it's a useful metaphor for the occasion.
It is, for sure. And there are just so many economies, countries that have that adopted these neoliberalism ideas in the late 70s, early 80s. And those economies, a lot of them have seen significant growth in GDP, but obviously that growth has been unequal. And you talked about it. There's still a huge chunk of society that doesn't have enough to subsist. So your book is about post growth, but how do we tell those people who are now, or how do we tell those people that we're now seeking a post growth society when they don't have enough as it is and never got to experience any of the benefits of growth?
Yeah, I mean, we don't. I think is the very simple answer to that question. There is no moral position which allows the people who have already had and have trashed the world in the process to tell the people who have never had and have no prospects of having that they can't improve the quality of their lives. That doesn't exist as a position. I mean, I think that behind your question is a really, really important point about where income growth does make a difference. And it's a point I didn't address it so strongly in post growth, but I addressed it quite clearly in Prosperity Without Growth, which was the previous book, a sort of predecessor in a way to Post Growth. That was a much more policy-oriented book and a much more, if you like, an exploration of the scientific evidence and the data. And there's one particular part in that book where I explore that issue very, very clearly and look at the places where income growth makes a difference to people's lives in terms of the quality of their lives. And it's very, very clear. It's for the poorest. If you're giving people enough income and enough security that they can have decent nutrition, basic housing, clean, safe water supplies, clean energy supplies, then you are making a massive difference to the material quality of people's lives. And it shows. The statistics absolutely show that. And that should be our focus, it seems to me, is bringing people out of poverty, giving them decent conditions. And I'm not saying that in the process, that means that we tell them that they should develop like we've developed. I don't think actually it's our job to tell them anything, to be honest. I think our job on the other hand is really to take responsibility for our own lifestyles, for our own sense of social progress, and actually to shift off that growth-based path quite specifically, because we know there isn't enough room on the planet for the material improvement that's needed for ordinary poorer people in low-income countries if the rich countries insist on that growth-based path. So post-growth, in a sense, is much more dedicated to that idea of what comes next, particularly for the advanced economies, also possibly for poorer countries as well, if there's something on offer. But that's kind of their decision, it seems to me. It's not our decision to sort of say, well, this is how you should live, guys, because we've trashed the planet for you. Our responsibility is very much the opposite of that, to say, it's up to us now to change this dysfunctional, derelict, moribund model of progress into something better.
Well, you talk about early in the book that we might actually be living in a post-growth society now, and we have been for a while, because the growth rates of productivity have diminished significantly over the last 50 years. Why is slowing labor productivity so problematic for capitalism's survival?
Well, you've got to kind of think of it this way, that labor productivity growth, I mean, this is, what I'm trying to do is set out the kind of logic of why that's problematic. And then afterwards, I think there's a conversation about why in human terms actually it's not such a bad thing. But the logic in terms of capitalism is quite clear, that labor productivity growth means that you can produce more with each hour of a worker's labor in the economy. So and that, to, if you think of yourself, put yourself in a position of an entrepreneur, of an employer, that's a good thing, because it means you can produce more by paying less in terms of wages. And so you increase your margins because you can reduce your costs. And always that seems to be, certainly in the capitalist model, that's a good thing, because if you have bigger margins, you can afford to pay your workers more, you can afford to pay your shareholders more, you can invest more in the technologies of the future that will give you, the next generation of profit margins that you hope will be bigger again, and that can lead to, a kind of positive, virtuous cycle of growth, were it not for the fact that that's also at the same time potentially kind of trashing the planet. But in principle, that's the model of capitalism under which we're working: good profit margins, higher wages, better shareholder dividends, and more investment in the future to keep the whole thing going. Once profit margins start getting squeezed, then you're in a much more difficult situation. So when labor productivity stops growing and your wages are growing, your profit margins are squeezed, you can't afford to pay your wages, more wages to your workers, and pay more dividends to your shareholders, and invest more in the future. And that's, when you look at the trends, that's kind of what we saw happening, particularly in a country like the US. We saw, actually, as labor productivity growth began to decline, we saw that wages were depressed even below labor productivity growth. We saw that investment in new technologies, real investment in the future, began to slow down. And the thing that got protected was the shareholders' dividends to shareholders. And that was how that battle between workers, the owners of capital, and the future was resolved during that period of 50 years or so, between the peak labor productivity in around about the mid-1960s, ironically, and its decline to much lower rates of labor productivity growth through by the time of the financial crisis, actually. And one of the arguments I make in the book is that it was that decline in labor productivity growth and our particular solution to it to protect the interests of capital, and to make essentially to place a kind of an incentive to speculate in financial markets, that was what created and led to the financial crisis. I don't know if you want me to talk further about, the flip side of that coin, and there's lots of questions you could ask about why that growth in labor productivity slowed down, and there's all sorts of theories around that. But one of the interesting things to me about that slowing down of labor productivity growth is it's not necessarily a bad thing. Fast labor productivity growth is typical of materially based production processes where you can replace people's time with machines, and that's a continuing process. There's a view of the future which has labor virtually excluded from any of that manufacturing distribution process whatsoever, and possibly even from some of the design processes as well. But it's very difficult. It's much more difficult to achieve labor productivity growth in areas which are actually quite essential to our well-being, like care. It's the doctor's time with the patient, it's the nurse's time on the round, it's the teacher's time with the kids, it's the social carer's time with our grandparents. It's the time that care takes in the economy, which is very, very difficult to do away with. There aren't machines that do that well. It's not a commodity that you can get better by chasing labor productivity growth in it. In fact, labor productivity growth in the care sector actually is responsible for very, very poor worker well-being, for really stressed environments for some of the people who matter most in society. And I suppose for me, that's one of the critical points, because we've just gone through a massive health crisis where we've just realized that the frontline workers those nurses, those carers, those shop assistants, the cleaners in society, for example, the places where human labor still really matters, they became the most insecure sector, the most insecure livelihoods, and yet they turned out to be the most important people in society. So that's a kind of a, it's an indication really that of exactly what the challenge is, that the capitalist model does labor productivity growth really well, but it has failed to protect, support, and nourish an economy of care.
Yeah, you talk about how capitalism has denigrated labor, and to the examples that were widely visible during the COVID-19 pandemic. I'm going to talk about Hannah Arendt, the German American political theorist, and I'd just like to get your thoughts on her definitions or her the differences between work and labor, and why that distinction is so important.
It's an interesting one, isn't it? I mean, she points out in the book, and it's The Human Condition. It was written in published in 1957, and she points out that in every language that we know of, there are these two words for work, broadly speaking, and she kind of, and she uses that creatively, really creatively, excuse me, to kind of suggest this distinction that labor is about the basic processes of maintenance and care for life and sustenance, and that some of these processes, are quite visceral processes. They're about getting your hands dirty. They're about the time that you spend. They're about, sometimes in the past, certainly have been about kind of hard labor, if you like, and that they absorb us. They are, their processes actually, and she has this rather strange idea that they're the processes and the points in our lives where we could be said to be truly happy, because we don't spend much time thinking about anything except the task that we're immersed in, and we're tired from it at the end, which allows us rest. And once we've recuperated, we can throw ourselves into those tasks of labor with the same sort of sense of being really in the world. So that's a very interesting. I'm not sure that everybody would necessarily agree with the idea that when you're heavily engaged in those tasks, that is being happy. But it's an interesting reflection on what happiness is, and that happiness is sometimes that real visceral engagement in the physical world. And then she says, once we lift our eyes from that labor, it's in some senses, we do have that sense of relief. We have that sense of space. We have that sense of time. There are other things to do in the world. And yet at the same time as it offers us that space, it also confronts us with our most existential fear, which is the fear of our own mortality, our sense that our lives are temporary and short, that we have to make the most of them, that we have to be seen to make the most of them, that we have to compare ourselves with all the other people who are also trying to make the most of them, and wanting to think of ourselves not as just temporary beings with a finite life, but as people whose influence goes on forever potentially, and has, creates memories for others and creates a sense of permanence in the world. And she relates this almost existential insecurity to the purpose of work as opposed to labor. And this work is the work of creating durability. It's the work of trying to achieve some sense of permanence. It's the work of building structures that speak to social progress and to human progress. It's the work ultimately of things like art. So a work of art is really an attempt to create the durability that doesn't really exist in our physical, visceral world. So that's the separation that she creates. The interesting fact about it is that capitalism essentially destroys both of those things. It has no place for the visceral workers who are denigrated to the lowest ranks of society, as you said, but it also has no place for durability, because durability is an anathema to capitalism, because capitalism proceeds through constant innovation, for constant replacing of the old with the new. And that's a necessary part of our engagement as consumers in the economic system. And so capitalism continually presents us with insecurity so that we try to create permanence, but undermines the value of that permanence constantly because it needs to feed itself as an economic mechanism. So that Hannah Arendt wasn't saying all that in precisely those ways, but that distinction that she created between labor and work, and the way that she saw those and characterized those, I think is, that was a really interesting starting point for me in the book, to think through the relationship between capitalism and labor, and capitalism and work.
Yeah, I'd like to talk a little bit about, more about labor and, how we can create fulfilling jobs, especially those that can help us combat the climate crisis. This is the big part of the American president, Joe Biden's agenda, this American jobs plan. The idea is we're going to invest a lot in creating new jobs that are going to, be sustainable and good paying jobs. How does that plan, what's a good way for that plan to create those kinds of fulfilling jobs that also help us transition to a cleaner, more sustainable society?
I think there are lots of different ways of thinking about this, and the most obvious way in which we think about green jobs is jobs for people, building wind turbines, installing photovoltaics, perhaps sometimes insulating homes, although that does tend to be a kind of, poorer second cousin to the sexy tech industries that will save us. And that's a very conventional way of thinking about jobs in this green transition. I'm not saying it's not important. I think it is important. I believe in the power and the importance of technology in addressing some of the challenge of reaching a net zero or zero carbon economy. I think that's absolutely vital, transforming the energy systems, and that will create some of those jobs for sure in those technology sectors. But I think if you look at the economy from a from a more systemic point of view, actually, there's another route that you can think about these jobs, and that's the jobs in the sectors which have the lowest carbon footprints, the jobs in the sectors without high carbon intensity, that don't necessarily involve technology, that do involve people's time, and that because they involve people's time, they actually offer real employment opportunities, more employment opportunities potentially than jobs in the tech sector, which are always vulnerable to being taken away by automation or robots or artificial intelligence. And so it's thinking, I think, broadening that idea of green jobs to think about exactly that economy that I was talking about before, the economy where you have low labor productivity growth, where you have high elements of care and the application of people's time, and that the jobs, they are the jobs in health, they're the jobs in social care, they're the jobs in community services, they're the jobs in parks and museums and libraries and places where we can create quality of life. They're jobs in the manufacturing of durable products, and in repairing those products, and in recycling those products. The jobs actually, which the places of our economy which are labor intensity, which reduce material throughput, which are low in terms of carbon, and this is the challenge, in which it should be possible to create meaning and fulfillment, partly because many of those jobs involve the development of skill and the meeting of challenge. And that's one of my very particular themes in the book, that when you apply human skill to meet challenge, and you are capable of doing it because you possess that skill and develop that skill over time, that's a place where fulfillment lies. It's a phenomenon which psychologists call flow, when you have a good balance between the skill and the challenge. And it's interesting when you apply that to something like, healthcare. If I were to go into a healthcare situation, particularly a challenging one, I would not know what to do. I would be absolutely overwhelmed by that situation, which is where skill matters. You develop that skill as a nurse or a doctor, and you take that into that situation. But if they were put into a situation where, their skills were actually, not particularly relevant to the challenge, or indeed, so high that the challenge was trivial, then that would be a quite difficult, slightly boring place to be. And alternatively, if they were put into a situation where their skills were totally unable to meet that challenge because they were under pressure to meet deadlines or to get through quotas when actually it's time that delivers the product, then that job becomes almost impossible to do. And so that's where the policy impacts of your question really lies. Can we create the conditions which make those jobs not just available, but meaningful, doable, fulfillment, and offer fulfillment, as well as delivering the services that improve the quality of people's life in society? And to me, that idea, it goes beyond what's being talked about at the moment as a kind of green jobs plan. But it's absolutely clear when you look at the statistics that if you were to encourage and build that economy of care, you would have lower carbon output and you would have higher employment intensity than almost anything that you can do through technology alone.
Well, what about ecological investments? How does that play a role in the path forward?
Yeah, I mean, if you can think about it like this, in a way, what I've been trying to do with economics for some time, certainly since Prosperity Without Growth was first published a decade or so ago, and now also with post growth, I'm trying to sort of say, that our economics kind of went wrong, that fundamental aspects of it have been misconstrued. So we construe enterprise, for example, as kind of profit maximization through the mass production of material products that we consume as fast as possible. And that's what enterprise is construed as. But actually, at the heart of enterprise is a kind of idea of service, being in service to people. And people familiar with energy technologies will recognize that sort of transition from thinking about energy as a commodity to thinking about energy services. It's not, coal, oil, and gas that we need. It's thermal comfort and mobility and so on. And so that's rethinking, if you like. It's a rethinking of an economic concept, the concept of enterprise. And I think we can do the same thing with investment. We have to think of investment. We have to rescue investment, in a sense, from the damage that was done by neoliberal monetary policies, in particular in the second half of the 20th century, the financial crash that led to the financial crash in 2007 and 8, and even afterwards have been a place where investment has been kind of seen as a gambling casino. And to me, that's a travesty. That's not what investment was ever supposed to mean in economics. It wasn't a kind of, winner takes all game where you just tried to cash out your earnings as fast as possible. Investment actually is a fundamental relationship between the present and the future. It's putting aside some of our resources in the present in order to secure future prosperity. In other words, it's our commitment. Investment is our commitment to the future. And that, I think, is a way of reconceiving investment within economics. And what it does is it defines for us a new portfolio of investment. And that investment is not about the maximization of financial returns. It's about laying down the conditions for prosperity tomorrow, prosperity for our kids, prosperity for their kids. And immediately, the first thing that comes to mind, it seems to me, when you think of investment that way, is that you must invest in the quality of our ecological resources. We must be looking at investment as a regenerative action, as something that supports and nurtures and protects the natural resources on which tomorrow's prosperity depends. If you can't do that, you have no commitment to the future. If you're just running down your resources, if you're just overburdening your climate, if you're just destroying other species, then ultimately you're undermining the future. And investment isn't even worth the terminology of being investment. It's a kind of fool's strategy, which can never really benefit anyone but a few people in the very short term, and doesn't support the social good. It doesn't support our ecological integrity. So to me, ecological investment is kind of where you start on that process of rebuilding investment as a commitment to the future.
Well, and you've touched on this already a couple times in our conversation, but also in the book, another aspect of the economy, the capitalist economy that you really dismantle is this idea of competition is necessary and natural. I mean, you hear this argument all the time by people that champion free markets, that competition, is inherent to nature. And this whole idea is, okay, this was proven true by the findings of Charles Darwin. But, in your book, you argue that this is actually circular logic because of who influenced Darwin in the first place. So who was it that influenced Darwin, and why does that, just expose this flaw in circular logic?
Well, what it does is it suggests to us, actually, in some ways, why myths are important and how powerful they are, and why metaphors are so powerful as well. So this metaphor of competition and nature as a struggle for existence was a very powerful meme, I guess we could call it, although meme didn't exist in those days because it's basically a post-Darwinian term, but the sort of a very powerful cultural idea in Victorian society when Darwin was coming up with his ideas. And one of the people who was most influential on him, interestingly, was the parson Thomas Malthus. And one of the things I kind of like about thinking about Malthus is that he actually wrote his essay on population just about 15 miles away from where I am in the heart of Surrey, and it really was a very powerful essay. It's quite hard to sort of because we have so much in the way of new thinking and new essays and new books coming out all over the place at the moment. It's quite hard to see that one quite short pamphlets, as it originally was, could be so powerful. But it set in place a kind of mindset that captured the spirit of the times. It captured this idea that nature is an enormous and unending struggle for existence. It's a war of all against all, in the words of Hobbes, who predated Malthus, actually. But the state of nature is a state of war, and that actually everything is about competition. And then Malthus was a parson, so he was faced with the problem of thinking about why, if there was a benevolent God, we should all have been placed in this state of war. And his argument was trying to find what in 19th century, 20th century, I guess it was late 18th and early 19th century theology was called a theodicy, a way of sort of justifying the ways of God to man. And so actually the essay on population was kind of a way of thinking, what are the dimensions of this struggle? We're placed as an unending struggle. And he had this conversation with his dad, and you can just sort of imagine it. The parson, Malthus Senior, is a big friend of some of the romantics in the 19th century, and the romantics in the 19th century wanted to see the world as the best of all possible places. They wanted to see the benevolence of God as being visible in the world. And Malthus, who, a fairly young man at that time, listening to his dad saying, this can't be right, because actually we've got the population moves with geometric progression, so it's multiplicative, and the means of sustenance can only really be arithmetic, can only really be additive. And so eventually we're going to run out of stuff, because our population is expanding faster than the food supply, and so we have inevitable suffering. And then he spent the rest of his essay trying to justify why that might be a good thing, and you might still be able to believe in a benevolent God. But the bit of the essay that stuck, and this is a real lesson for people, writing essays that they want to stick, was the kind of, the maths, the logic, that point about the kind of inevitable suffering, life as a struggle for existence in which it's impossible for everyone to win. And the only force that could allow things to progress through that was a kind of competitive force that allowed you to win in the struggle for existence. And Darwin's very, he's very explicit about the influence that essay had on him. And he talks about it actually, in one place in his diary, saying, at last I had a place to work from after I'd read Malthus's essay. And it's exactly what gave him this idea, that we have this struggle, that we all compete in this struggle, that there are accidental variations in our abilities to compete, and those accidental variations then lead to evolutionary progress. And this sort of sense of a gradual evolutionary progress through competition in the struggle for existence was the basis of evolutionary theory, and that successful variations are selected, and that leads to eventually to new species and to new qualities in species. So if you like, Darwin was writing a theory about nature, but he was borrowing from a parson who was ultimately a kind of very early economist. And he had a very dismal theory about what society was about. He missed the possibilities for technological progress and the calming of that division between geometric and arithmetic conflict. But he also had a very dismal social politics, and it mainly came from, the idea that the people who won in the struggle for survival in Victorian England and through the middle of the Industrial Revolution were the ones who deserved to win, and there wasn't much he could do about the damage that was being caused in the process. In fact, he campaigned against the laws to protect those poorest people in society. So he was the origin actually of what Thomas Carlyle coined as the dismal science. Economics as the dismal science was coined on the back of Malthus's views. And so they were very secular views. We were looking at society at the time and saying, this is what we've got. This was the upsurge of capitalism. It was the shift of people out of subsistence lifestyles into really poor conditions in very polluting factories in crowded urban cities, and saying, this is what life is. This is the struggle for existence, guys. And then Darwin picks up that metaphor and pops it into evolutionary theory, which then becomes a kind of, this grand world-changing theory about the scientific basis of the world. But he's borrowed the central metaphor actually from the dismal science, from economics itself. And then after the fact, when evolution is acknowledged as this wonderful new science, economists then pick it up and say, well, look, competition must be natural because it's in the theory of evolution. and that's kind of where my story about Lynn Margulis in the book becomes so powerful, because she was the first biologist really to challenge the centrality of competition within evolution itself.
Yeah, that's definitely one of the characters who I admit I am embarrassed that I didn't know much about. And I didn't take a lot of biology classes in school, but who she was, and honestly who she was married to, you feel like I should have known who she was. So who was she, and what did she teach us about cooperation's role in nature?
So yes, Lynn Alexander, as her maiden name was, later to become Lynn Margulis, and we should probably say also, who her husband was, since you mentioned it. And her husband was Carl Sagan, famous philosopher of science, and in particular interested in kind of space exploration, the existence of life on other planets, and the possibilities of alien life forms. And actually, one of his projects later in life was to put together this collection of sort of iconic material from the Earth, to put it into a Venus-bound spaceship, in the hope that sooner or later some alien species will find us and find it and know a little bit about us back on Earth. And when he was very young, he met at university this bouncing, vivacious, inquisitive Lynn Alexander. And they very quickly became attracted to each other, and within 5 years were married, and a couple of years later they had a couple of kids, and so they created this kind of power couple. But whereas Carl Sagan's views were always about, life on other planets and life beyond planet Earth, it was very interesting because Lynn, in her studies, began to study microbiology, and she studied bacteria, and she studied, microspecies, and began to form a view, actually, which was quite an extraordinary view and completely against the received wisdom at the time, that it was the collaboration between these microscopic species that was responsible for the biggest leap in evolution that we have experienced in our lifetimes, and not in our lifetimes, in our geological history, in fact, and that actually much of the functioning of ourselves as a species, in the functioning of the functioning of our brains, owes quite a lot to the evolution of those very, very earliest species of bacteria in a part of evolution in which things were changing very, very fast. And then this massive step change happened through the collaboration of two different types of bacteria to create a new form of organism. And so it was this discovery, if you like, which was resisted by mainstream science for quite a long period of time, and was eventually accepted and now exists in biological textbooks as an idea, the idea of symbiosis, that led her to the idea that cooperation and collaboration were as important, if not more important, than competition in terms of evolution. And she also, regarded the kind of the neo-Darwinian fixation on competition as being a sort of having been essentially led astray by capitalism itself. And she called it a kind of capitalistic vision of evolution, and that a true vision of evolution would see these forces of competition and collaboration in balance with each other.
Well, do you think that the climate disaster is inevitable in a world driven by capitalism?
I think it's very hard to see how we get out of it. I mean, without challenging those fundamentals, without challenging that fundamental vision of ourselves as competitive, selfish, novelty-seeking, accumulative beings. And I hear this a lot. I mean, I'm regularly sort of asked, even in an event that I was in yesterday, how is it possible to tame human nature? Do you think we can tame this voracious, selfish, accumulative species, to tackle climate change? And I think to me, it isn't so much taming as framing human nature, because I think we live under a misguided interpretation of ourselves, and that interpretation is encoded in capitalism. And so you have to somehow free us. You have to free us from capitalism in order to see that we are not those capitalistic, rational, economic, usually male, probably white, of a certain age, power hungry beasts that are parading a jungle in which only they, as alpha males, can prevail. There are many, many other sides to human nature, and those sides are not captured by the personality that inhabits capitalism. In fact, in some sense, that personality is an aberration. I'm not saying that competition doesn't have its place, but it's a vision of humanity that lies at the edge of functionality and possibly sometimes into deep dysfunctionality. And yet we've placed that vision at the heart of the organizing system. We've incentivized behaviors that belong to that dysfunctionality. And we've done all of that in the name of progress through capitalism. So it does seem to me, I don't think we can be simplistic about it, but it does seem to me that we have to disentangle our view of ourselves from the view that lives inside capitalism in order to confront the challenges like the challenge of climate change. And that is a process that does demand that we take a very skeptical view of capitalism itself and begin to construct forms of organization and incentives about how we live that are more in line with who we are as a biological species. The elements, yes, exist in relation to competition. The circumstances in which they are functional also sometimes exist, but they don't exhaust the possibilities for our species in a world in which actually much of our evolution was social evolution, and that would not even have been possible were it not for the parts of the human psyche that evolved in ways which are profoundly social, profoundly cooperative, profoundly altruistic at times. And I think this it's a way of seeing, if you like, a rescue strategy that doesn't ask us to change human nature. It doesn't demand us to tame human nature. All it does is it asks us to establish institutions, structures, and incentives that appeal to who we really are as human beings, rather than to that dysfunctional caricature that capitalism prefers.
Well, post-growth is really a beautifully written dismantling of capitalism, which is this culprit of so many of society's and Earth's ills. And I thoroughly enjoyed reading this book and learning about, the ideas and all the characters that it contains. And we'll link to the book in our show notes so that our listeners can buy it and they can read it as well. But aside from the book, where else can our readers or our listeners find your thoughts on capitalism and ecological economics?
So as I mentioned, Postgrowth was a kind of sequel, although in some ways more of a prequel to Prosperity Without Growth, which was had its initial outing as a report to the UK government about 12 years ago, and then has been republished a couple of times, most recently in 2017. So I talk about a lot of the more policy relevant stuff, I suppose, in that second edition of Prosperity Without Growth. But you could also, of course, visit our work. I mean, the Centre for the Understanding of Sustainable Prosperity at the University of Surrey is a place where the scientific research behind these ideas, much of it has been developed, and our ongoing work on a kind of post-growth society is based. And you can find masses of information there at cusp.ac.uk.
Well, we will definitely link to that as well.
Brilliant.
Tim Jackson, thank you so much for joining the Climate Pod.
Thanks, Ty. It's been a pleasure.